Hello there, welcome back to Sorry What. Before we begin today's story, please show some love by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you, I really appreciate your support. Now on to the story. I discovered the gateway in my garage. Let me back up. I'm an assistant professor of physics at an Ivy League college, at just 28. I have a beautiful wife, a healthy trust fund, and although I have an IQ that Sheldon Cooper would envy, I was a gifted athlete in both high school and university. Modestly, I'm trim, fit and good looking. I am, according to my friends, family, and acquaintances, the complete package, the envy of one and all. Sounds great, doesn't it? Believe me, it isn't. My wife, Renee, is a walking wet dream, but from a deeply religious background. One thing that her religious parents couldn't dissuade her from was her love of theater. I met her when she was a Greek maiden in our university's production of Antigone. She was mesmerizing on the stage, the personification of grace, beauty, and a truly sexy peach. I couldn't wait to get my hands on that peach. We dated, but that's when her background and her parents stepped in. We, or she, had to wait until marriage. I waited with her, of course, but before meeting her, I had the sex life that a good-looking high school and college letterman can expect. And then some. So, by the time we hit the honeymoon trail, a 3-month yacht tour through the Mediterranean, my balls were best described as cobbles for their cobalt color. The honeymoon was wondrous, with all the action I could have dreamed of from my curvaceous bride. And before we returned, my wife delighted me with the news of her pregnancy. I was over the moon, climbing up the rigging and howling from the top of the mast. Imagine my surprise when the loving dried up when we returned to the loving arms of her mother and minister father. Mission accomplished, breeding successful, and suddenly maybe a Saturday night, if I was lucky, a couple of times a month, and none of that deviate kinky stuff. That seemed to eliminate anything beyond missionary. But, she explained, the baby needed to be protected, so nothing in the last trimester. Well, I understood, although I brought forth literature and medical experts to assure her that it was safe and healthy, and wouldn't endanger our offspring. Nothing swayed her, and, since I loved her and already loved our developing kid, I suppressed my urges and concentrated on spoiling the soon-to-be mother. Now, Danny's 5, and sex is still limited to less times a month than the fingers on my left hand. Not having to use both hands to count the sexual acts at least left my right hand free to pick up the slack. I mean, I love my wife, but she might as well have locked me in a clock cage. Yes, I hear the jeers about what a wimp I am, but I love my wife, I love my kid, and I'm not a cheater. I just can't do it. In my deepest depression, I dream of divorce, of pinning Renee down and taking her like a caveman, of working my way through the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, but it all comes to nothing. The heart wants what the heart wants, and my honor doesn't allow me to stray. So, duck you, sue me. The wet dream wife is just that, a ducking wet dream. And being the wonder kind at work. Also, more cringe-worthy than envy-worthy. I am, without undue modesty, a genius. A triple niner Einstein quality, genius, with a capital G. My PhD thesis on string theory rocked the academic world, and made me the youngest ever assistant professor at my university. It brought in an impressive number of grants. The problem came when my department had informed me that at this university, assistant professors couldn't be project heads, although the research would be based on my paper and original theories. That's okay, I thought, as long as I got to explore my theories. I agreed, and was introduced to Professor Angus Tyburn, a 64-year-old tenured professor who, I was later to learn, hadn't had an original thought in 40 years, if not longer. Tyburn was so pleasant in the introductory meeting with the department head, so complimentary to my theories, intelligence, and ability to express my ideas in understandable language. It wasn't until our grants were settled, the lab set up, and the research began that I realized that Tyburn was determined not to be eclipsed by the wonderkind. If my wife had my clock in a virtual clock cage, Tyburn was determined to do the same to my mind. My suggestions were dismissed out of hand, with Tyburn informing me that no hotshot shortcuts were going to be taken on his watch. The meteor assignments were passed to cronies of Tyburn's, assistant professors who would never advance further. Basically, Tyburn relegated me to cleaning up the lab and polishing the microscope lenses. No, not literally, that would have been too meaningful an assignment for me to be given. But it gives you an idea of the valuable contributions I was allowed to make. I was given the most tedious and odious jobs. Why didn't I scream? I did. I went to the department head, who was surprised to see that Tyburn had arranged the grants with his iron grip on the money and the research. I was hardly mentioned. Sadly, the head informed me that if I left the project, I would basically be surrendering my ideas to Tyburn, and would likely have trouble getting grants in the future. I'd also have to leave the university and surrender my professorship. In short, I was getting ducked more at work than at home. In the end, I decided to suck it up for a while. At home, Renee and I were basically living separate lives, hers taken up with Danny, volunteer work, and her religious activities, which hadn't been in evidence during our courtship, and mine taken up with avoiding her. The sight, smell, and feel of her made my heart in cobbles ache. It was just too hard. Yes, my deck and everything else. I'd taken to sleeping in one of the guests' rooms and was slowly moving my things there. I decided that with that free time, I'd begin dealing with the overwhelming frustration that Tybern was causing me. After all, I was a wonderkind, and though my heart made me a wimp at home, there was no love lost in the physics department. The house I'd inherited from my grandparents included a separate 5-car garage, with 2 unused chauffeurs' quarters above it. I had the furthest 2 stalls walled off and finished into a working lab. The remaining 3 stalls were enough for the cars of my wife and I, along with an old Stutz Bearcat that grandfather had treasured. Back when I was writing my thesis, I almost got sidetracked by my fascination with quantum entanglement. The idea that 2 particles, although separated by theoretically limitless distance, would both react instantaneously to stimuli applied to just one of them, filled me with wonder and possibilities. Foremost, just think of the communication possibilities. A man in Alpha Centauri would be able to communicate in real time across the light years with someone on Earth. One hell of a powerful device. Now, in my garage, I decided to try to understand the phenomena. I could satisfy my scientific curiosity and fill my time at home with an independent project. 3 years. 3 years of even less sex at home, and 3 years of Tybern's snide belittling of the wonderkind. I'd heard from students who liked me how Tybern constantly belittled me, with comments of how overblown rumors of my genius had been, and how little I understood my own thesis. He openly wondered if the theories were really mine, and hinted that I had somehow accessed papers he had prepared, and had stolen his ideas. Tybern cleverly only made statements in front of students and faculty whose futures he could heavily impact, who were unwilling to risk those futures by testifying against him. He denied making the statements to the department head and, unable to find anyone who would admit hearing him directly, the department head told me that there was nothing he could do. He was hesitant to tarnish Tybern's reputation by publishing any denials or rebuttals to the rumors. I fumed and spent as little time at the school as possible. I thought Tybern an incompetent scientist, but apparently he made up for it by playing the academia game to perfection. Tenured asshole. At home, I began working on a mechanism which I hope would help locate and corral entangled particles. I was striving to learn their cause, in the hopes of being able to replicate them in the numbers that commercialization would require. If I could solve it, the rewards would stagger the imagination. My machine was ready. It should give me information on the harmonics and tones of the particles, which I could compare to particles assumed to be non-entangled. I flipped the switch and held my breath. The readouts remained unchanged. I flipped the switch off, then back on. Nothing. I sighed in defeat. 3 years, and the ducking universe was going to clock-block me, along with Renee and Tybern. I jumped up and paced the room. It was on the 3rd turn around that I noticed that the floor tiles were green. I had had the room tiled in a black and white checkerboard, but it was now solid green. I looked around the room and in a 12-foot circle around my device, the checkerboard flooring was still intact. I returned to my machine and turned it off. The flooring returned to the checkerboard throughout the room. I walked around the room. Nothing had changed. I went back and turned the machine back on. The floor, outside the circle I was in, went green. I hurriedly flicked off the machine, wondering if I was seeing a radiation effect of some kind. I shut everything down. Surrounded by every kind of sensor and detector I could find, I flicked the switch again. Nothing changed. Nothing on the sensors, anyway. The floor went green. But no radiation, no air contamination, no pathogens detected. I breathed easier and opened the helmet on my pressurized radiation suit. The suit might have been overkill, but better safe than sorry. I shut the suit and opened the door into the rest of the garage. First thing I noticed was that there was no Bearcat. The space was filled by a pile of boxes. My car was in its slot, but Renee's car was missing. Her garage door began rising. Surprise, I dashed back into my lab and turned off the machine. I'm not sure why my instinct was to avoid seeing Renee. There were just too many questions I needed answers to, tests I wanted to make. It only took me another month to reach a hypothesis that worked for me. Back in the radiation suit, I tested it. By putting a certain amount of pressure on one of the particles, the green floor disappeared. The checkerboard also disappeared, as did the wall I had installed to create my lab. After checking all the sensors, I walked out of my circle and checked out the garage. It was almost exactly the same as it was before I built the lab. The only thing I noticed was the dust had a distinct reddish quality that hadn't been there before. Resisting the temptation of going outside and risking being sidetracked, I returned to the mechanism and turned the dials, changing the pressure on the particle. My wall reappeared, and the floor was now reddish rolled industrial linoleum. I walked to the door, opening it to check out the rest of the garage. Two men in lab coats looked up from their electron microscopes in surprise. You'd think that they'd seen a spaceman. I forgot about the radiation suit. Running back, I shut down the machine. While I didn't understand everything, I had developed a good working theory. What I was experiencing, obviously, were parallel universes I was transferring to by applying pressure to the entangled particle. Therefore, I postulated that with tone and harmonics, particles had another quality, one I would name tilt. The tilted particles are what separate and create parallel universes. One thing that has always puzzled me in attempting to understand the concept of parallel universes was the idea that everything could change and create another parallel. That means, in 1 second, there could be a mind-numbing number of alternative universes based on the decisions and actions of any one person. Even if it was simple binary decisions, that means a universe could be created every second by each person on Earth. Yet, we cling to the idea that parallel universes would somehow be familiar to us, although they might have changed 10, 20, 100, or 1000 years ago. We think there could be one where Hitler won the war, but we'd still be essentially ourselves in that universe. Is it just some kind of hubris on our part, or some instinctive understanding of the universes, like a bird, knowing when to fly south, or a newborn horse understanding how to stand and walk, albeit wobbly? My thesis is that most particles, the ones we see as non-entangled, are actually fully entangled. I call them static particles. They add inertia to the fabric of existence, and keep the universes in a familiar weave across all of the parallels. There are others, free radicals of a sort, that allow the changes to occur. In the weave of each universe, they affect the warp and weft, giving each verse its unique colors and textures. Are the statics always fully entangled? I don't know yet. It may be that over time radicals fall into line, and a static might begin wobbling off on their own. I believe some of the static particles might break loose and wobble fully into other universes, becoming the quantum entanglement particles that we are able to observe. We're really seeing the particle from our weave and one that belongs in another weave. One more difference in our separate creations, but because they're static across dimensions, what happens to one happens to the others. My mechanism allows me to adjust the tilt of a particle which carries me in my 12-foot bubble to a different parallel. I'm always able to release the tilt and return home. I wanted to begin exploring. So far, after exposing myself to the two guys in lab coats, I had only sat in my chair bouncing from verse to verse, recording what I've found. Now, I wanted to go further and see some of the worlds out there. Exploring has some drawbacks. Already I was taking precautions. I wear the suit into each new universe, sometimes finding myself very glad I had. Whether nuclear war or natural disaster, I've ended up in desolate areas that have set my sensors screaming. I've rigged the mechanism to instantly release the tilt when any sensor moves. I'm not going to end up stranded in some hellhole when incapacitated by something unexpected. After feeling the strong winds in that desolate place, I have a vision of being blown out of my sphere, and then having the sensors return home without me. I resolved to belt myself in. However, going outside the lab was going to be tricky. I'm afraid to go too far away from my equipment. Leaving it unguarded could strand me in an unfriendly place of risk exposure. Or random radiation could return the device to Earth Prime, as I was beginning to think of home, without me. In some worlds, the garage might not exist, and random animals could do damage. How to be safe and explore. The first problem was the safety of the equipment. I had to measure the shape and dimension of the bubble the device created. I did this by hanging streamers from the 20-foot garage ceiling in a 14 square around the device. When I moved universes, the first time I got out of the bubble, through the streams and nothing had changed. I tried again and arrived in a universe where I hadn't strung streamers. They were still hanging in the bubble but had disappeared outside of it. It was spooky to see the unattached ends hanging by themselves, but it did allow me to see the boundaries of the bubble. It showed that the device created a bubble, almost exactly 12 feet 2 inches in diameter. I constructed a 10 feet circular platform and covered it with a dome that mirrored the bubble, with a 2 feet safety margin. I moved all the equipment into the new metal shelter, which had a door I could securely lock, but open without a key. Solar panels covered the outside, so I wouldn't run out of power off-world, so to speak, if the garage or electricity was missing in that verse. Water tanks and emergency ration stores were added to help me survive if time became a factor, say, if I had to make repairs to the equipment. Then drugs and medical equipment, in case I had to repair myself. Of course, tools and testing equipment took up some space, but with the curvature of the dome, that space would have gone unused in any case. Lastly, I added clothing to fit all weather and conditions, from tropical heat to Arctic frost. I did chuckle to myself when I packed up a tuxedo. Hey, there might be a formal universe out there. You never know how ducked up a world could be. With my equipment and my return protected as much as possible, I began to venture out into the world outside the garage. The first dozen or so stops, I just stepped outside the building and took note of things. I often found the colors that my counterparts in these realms had chosen to paint my house with jarring, but more often I was enchanted by the subtle differences in the colors and textures of the world. Skies that varied from a rather putrid green to a blazing orange, a purple moon, and the surprisingly attractive and stimulating texture of a grass lawn as black as night, set off by trees of grays and flowers with a titanium gleam. I took samples and pictures at each stop, then hurried back to my dome ship. Yeah, call me a geek. I named it Enterprise. I planned to study and compare the differences and relate them as far as possible to the tilt of each dimension. That kept me busy for some time. I was tempted to plant some of the plants I collected, but was afraid of contaminating my world. I didn't want to introduce killer grass or interdimensional kudzu. I added some firearms to Enterprise, even adding some firing ports, which could be opened if required. An electric bike seems a reasonable addition. I might need transportation somewhere. And maybe a barbecue, in case I had to cook some off-world animal. Off-dimensional or off-universes seem so unwieldy, so I've decided just to treat each stop as another world. It didn't take long for me to realize I was stalling. I was surprised to realize that I was afraid of dying or getting stuck somewhere. I considered revealing my secrets to someone else, but decided I wasn't ready for that yet. I was terribly afraid of cross-contaminating other worlds. And I felt proprietary about my universes. My heart broke on the first world I went out to explore, universe number 113. Explore might be too strong a word. Since the garage on this world was empty, except for a weirdly painted purple and green bear cat, I decided to check out my house here. The kitchen was very familiar, but when I entered the living room, I had to stop and sit in a chair. The walls were almost completely covered with framed pictures of my beautiful Renee, in her birthday suit, engaged in sex. Looking around, I could have filled a Karma Sutra with the images I saw. Renee, blonde, redhead, brunette, long hair, pixie cut, head shaved. Tattoos, nip-nips rings, nose rings, peach plugs, giving head, DPs, TPs, lesbian action, interracial. I realized many of the pictures were framed images from corner DVD covers. The others looked like they were shots from those same DVDs. Renee shown from each image, smiling around those clocks she was sucking. I staggered into the library. I'm not sure why it affected me so. Logically, I knew this wasn't my Renee. But still, it sure looked like her. In the den, the shelves were lined with DVD covers. Looking over the titles, I saw that some starred Renee Friel, the Gangbang Queen. It took me a minute to realize Friel was either pronounced Friol or Friol. By 113 Renee had a successful acting career here, it seemed. I saw a rack full of adult film awards, engraved with her name. I then got a big surprise. There were several for the Producer of the Year and Director of the Year. Me. I took some of the DVDs with me when I returned home. Luckily, or unluckily, the DVD format seemed consistent with ours. Renee was definitely a star. I was hard watching her. I recognized some of her natural moves from my honeymoon, although they were now polished to perfection, where my Renee had been a novice in those early months. She seemed to relish any abuse and humiliation. I threw up several times before pausing the playout. Still, ignoring the disgusting scenes, she was the image of sexual attraction. I stopped traveling for a while. Tyburn was beginning to notice my absences, and so were the donors who made grand spaces, they thought, on my participation. Still not given any real meat, my presence was demanded in the lab. So, I would show up and dream of 113 Renee. Danny was more often than not now in the care of the nanny, so I began relieving her in the evenings, bonding with my now 9-year-old son. He was a bright kid and fun to play with. He loved video games and introduced me to Roblox and other platforms. I found the game simplistic but loved spending the time with him. Until, of course, the universe vomited on me, again. When Danny, mad that I had told him that he had to go to bed after this game, was mopping the floor with me in one of the games, he casually commented that Uncle Glenn's a lot better at this than you are. And he lets me stay up late when we're over there. Uncle Glenn. Who's Uncle Glenn? I don't think I currently knew any Glens. Oh, he's Mama's friend. My innocent son replied without missing a move on the screen. He slaughtered me because at that point I came to a dead stop. The detective was surprised at how open my wife's double life was. Apparently, most of her friends were happy when Glenn accompanied them as my wife stayed. When she had claimed to be traveling for the charities my wealth allowed her to support. When she claimed to be off visiting her parents. Or when she was out on girls' night. Glenn either accompanied her or they skipped it all to shack up at his place or in her hotel room, for which I was paying. She even took Danny and his nanny with her when she had to, letting him play video games and bribing the nanny to keep her secrets. Then there were all the acting lessons and seminars that I paid for. The detective wasn't sure if any were real, but Gregor, her primary coach, only had private lessons with her at his place. Now I know why she rarely got a speaking part in our community theater. She had a clock in her mouth. My wife really was a Renee Frill. Just not for me. When I confronted Renee, it was the cliche, if you divorce me, you'll just be paying for me to sleep with my lovers, and you'll hardly ever see Danny. Hell, he's already bonded more with Glenn than you, anyway. Yes, I'm a wimp. I retreated to the lab, cursing my charmed existence. Lucky me. Lucky wonderkind. Lucky to be married to Renee. Looking at the DVDs from World 113, I began to see my Renee in the images. Angry, I spun the dials to return to 113. Renee Frill's car was in the garage, so I marched up to the house. When I stepped into the family room, I found her watching TV. The room was also decorated in Renee corn, including a full-size statue, nude of course. When she saw me enter the room, her eyes flew open, wide, and she dropped to her knees on the floor with her forehead pressed to the floor. I pulled up short, nonplussed. Did I look that angry? I didn't want to scare my kid. Where's Danny? I demanded. Her head came off the floor, fear dominating her face. Who's Danny? She began shaking her head in panic. There's nobody here, master. I swear. I've been good. I've been good. Her head was bad on the floor, but her back was heaving as she panted in terror. Our son. Where's our son? What's he called in this world? Not Danny, I guess. Her back stopped heaving as she looked up in puzzlement. Our son. Are you okay, master? We don't have a son. I lashed out, my anger still controlling me. I couldn't confront my Renee, but with this whore, I'd give it my all. Why? Because you're such a whore. Because you so enjoy black clock and gangbangs. Because you love humiliation. I grabbed her hair and pulled her to her feet to look her in the eyes. Tears poured down her face, but I saw anger growing in her eyes. In defiance, she pushed me back and yelled, "You make me, you ducker. I wasn't a whore until you made me one. You bought me from my father because I wouldn't date you, and then you made me a whore. If I wouldn't spread my legs, you'd ruin my parents, my brothers, and I'd still be raped by your friends. I ducking hate you." She screamed directly into my face before realizing what she said. Looking at my shocked face, horror spread across her features, and she dropped back to her knees and prostrated herself, begging, "Master, please forgive me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever you want. I'll agree with the facial tattoos, the breast augmentations, whatever you want. Please, please forgive me." She sobbed, breaking my heart. "Please don't hurt my brothers. Please, leave them alone, please." She could hardly breathe. I knelt and took her into my arms. There. I couldn't think of anything else to say. She looked at me, more puzzled than ever. I could see her mind working and saw terror forming. "Don't play with me. Please, I'll do anything. Don't hurt my family. I'm not teasing. I'm not a genius for nothing. My plans were formed in a minute. Come with me." I smiled at her compliant, though fearful, "Yes, master." I didn't explain, although her eyes bugged out when we entered the Enterprise. I powered up for home. I put her up in the chauffeur's quarters and went into the house, where my real whore waited. I told her we needed to talk and went to get a bottle of wine. I told her to sit in the living room, and I poured the wine in the kitchen, adding the sleeping pills I had taken from the drug supplies on the Enterprise. What did we talk about? It doesn't matter. Just be assured that she wasn't facing the whim she was accustomed to. I told her she'd be the one to never see Danny again, and I was sure that she would be ducking the whole world soon enough. I didn't say which world. As the drugs began to have an effect on her, her eyes half closed and her head lolled. But in vino veritas. Or in this case, in medicamentis veritas. I did ask her why she was so into sex with Glenn when she had pretty much shut me off. Was I that bad? You seemed to enjoy our honeymoon. She smiled wryly and sadly said, "I did enjoy our honeymoon. It was wonderful. Couldn't have been better." Then why? Still a wimp, I felt my voice break on the question. She shook her head. "My parents. You saw them when we returned. Mom was horrified when I told her how much I had enjoyed sex. She told my father, and suddenly I was being prayed over by them and all my dad's deacons. It was humiliating. They tried to exorcise the demons out of me. They finally stopped when I promised to restrict the act to procreation." "Duck." I grunted. "Those bastards. Why didn't you just talk to me? You'd have gone to them, and my life would have been miserable. You're too honest. Sex wasn't worth it." She was drifting off. So, I probed. You like sex with other men? She moaned. With women. She just licked her lips and smiled, lazily. I continued, how about gangbangs? Her face was split by a big smile. Oh, yes, pleases. She started to drift off. Can we have one now? In a bit, I think you'll have all you want, and a wonderful acting career. I sneered at her as she began sagging in her seat. So you wouldn't duck me, but how did you start with? I was cut off by her answer. I found John. He didn't care what my dad thought, and he had a big John. I thought it was Glenn. Whose? I began to ask, but then realized she was out. I put her over my shoulder, and carried her out to Enterprise, still wondering John. And wondering how many others. I returned 20 minutes later, after leaving her in her birthday suit on the couch in the 113 house. I left her a note. It just said, "Welcome to the final frontier," which... Renee 113 was kneeling, forehead on the floor. This was apparently position 1. For added points, she was in her birthday suit. The tattoos were disturbing, but my claw kind of twitched at the nip-nops rings. They seemed a little large for her breast, however. The scars and brands, though, gave me the shivers, and I went soft. It took me almost an hour to get her off the floor and sit with me. The scotch and chicken dinner I had delivered helped a lot. Apparently, chicken isn't a thing for 113ers. She was amazed at how good our poultry tasted. There, I guess it tasted like crow. It took another hour after dinner before we could have a serious talk. That was because for dessert, she dropped back to her knees and began pulling down my pants. Stop. I yelled, and she dropped to the floor, startled and afraid. I pulled her back up to her chair. No one here is going to make you have sex. You don't have to be a whore for me. I know how much you hated it. She had been sitting slumped over, dejected by my rejection. Now she popped up and smiled. She lit up the room with her smile, although having seen the DVDs I knew this was no Mary Richards. No, I love sex, she boasted. I didn't like being forced, beaten, humiliated or ganged. I only want to have sex with one man. It should have been my husband, but I never loved him. I hated him and he punished me for it by making me whore and a corn star. She stopped and the look of worry returned. What are you going to make me do? If you're my husband here, it's your right. What do I have to do for you? Tears began in her eyes. I could see she thought I'd find something more horrible than whoring for her to do. I laughed. Here, we don't make our women do anything they don't want to. In fact, we couldn't if we wanted to. It's illegal and the women would have our balls if we tried. I paused, thinking, although there are women who allow their men to dominate them. With a mercurial ability to change moods that my Renee had lacked, 113 beamed again. I knew I liked you. I felt it on your vessel. It's like every atom in my being was reaching out to you. She slid back to her knees, and soon my pants were off, and the cobalt color was being sucked forcefully, and expertly, very expertly, out of my balls. The sex that followed made my honeymoon look like the rest of my marriage, sexless. They talk about the woman not being able to walk the next day. Well, I'm still a wimp. It was me on shaky legs the next 2 days. There were a lot of adjustments to be made and some tense moments. Getting her to stop calling me master was harder than I would have thought. It took me a while to explain that my deck wasn't a tailpipe, and she didn't have to suck off the chrome. She didn't understand any of that. At the weirdest times, she'd ask me, still puzzled, why someone would want to suck on a tailpipe. Danny never questioned the substitution. It seemed to work for him. Renee's maternal instincts clicked in, and she fell in love with my son instantly, and held him or cuddled him whenever she could. She also became an almost constant companion to him, playing his video games and taking him for walks and playing in parks. She asked me why we had a nanny. I told her because my son had been motherless until now. She teared up and ran to hold him. He snuggled in, but never dropped the game controller or missed a move in the game. Then, her parents called, planning to visit. That put me into a panic. They'd never accept this tattooed version of their daughter. For one thing, her blue eyes were almost violet, and her skin had a startling paleness she hadn't had before, giving my new Renee a strikingly ethereal appearance. I had a friend upstate, who was a doctor with a private clinic. He specialized in celebrity plastic surgeries. I piled Renee into the car, and we drove up to the clinic. I couldn't tell him about the parallel universes, so I just told him that my wife had had a wild side and gotten pierced and tattooed, and now regretted it. After an examination, he laid out a plan to remove the tattoos and piercings. He would also use his plastic surgeon abilities to repair the scars and cover the brand on her peach cheeks. But it would take time. We drove out to the countryside, followed by the doc in an ambulance. I had Renee join him, and then drove into a tree. The plan was to dent the car and use the accident as a cover story for why Renee was in the clinic for so long. The plan was great, but I was a little too energetic selling it. To Renee's horror, I slammed into the tree, twice as fast as I needed to, according to the doc. He told me that when I woke up in the clinic the next day. Airbags are great, but he still had to repair my nose and set the leg that had gotten broken when the engine decided to enter the cabin area. It was lucky he had brought the ambulance. Renee never left my side, holding my hand throughout the night. I ended up staying with her the whole time, even after the doc released me. The nurses never gave up teasing me about being Master. Renee came to me, puzzled. Master. Why do they keep calling me Genie? I keep telling them I'm Renee. We stayed off the grid for 3 weeks. The tattoos had been easier to remove than expected. Some difference in the makeup of inks between worlds. The longer stay was necessary for plastic surgeries on the scars and branding. Even that went quickly, with Renee heading without any scarring or any sign of the work. Doc congratulated himself on his skill, but I wondered if quick healing was a feature of World 113. I had called work and told them about the accident, so my problems were covered. It was for Renee that the absence created problems. Glenn was sure I'd killed Renee in a fit of jealousy, but checking with the university, it was easy for the police to track me down and talk with Renee. When Glenn showed up and forced himself into her room, Renee slapped him and demanded to know what kind of lowlife asshole, my words, would pursue a married woman. As the nurses clapped and cheered, Glenn departed, his tail between his legs. Her parents were the real challenge. They showed up a few days after Glenn, and were shocked by the general good nature of my new wife. After one look at the eye and skin coloring, and they accused me of killing their daughter and replacing her with lookalike. Again, the police were called and took my wife away for questioning, after handcuffing me to my bed. I sweated for hours, cursing myself for not checking to see if fingerprints duplicated across the worlds, or if I was going to get hung by the differences. I didn't know. There were so many subtle differences, it could go either way. Renee returned, smiling. She told me that she had told her parents that she never wanted to see them, ever again, and to leave us alone. She had harbored anger against her 113 father for selling her, and having had to prostitute herself for his safety. And her parents in this world seemed to be just as sanctimonious and self-righteous as her 113 pair. It worked for me. I blamed them for ruining my marriage to Earth Prime Renee. Doc had taken x-rays of my wife, to check for any undiagnosed problems that might have occurred with the abuse that had scarred her. He didn't find any, but did report finding an ethnogistral implant. A what? We both asked in unison, which made my wife giggle. A birth control implant. You didn't know you had one? He asked, amazed. No, Master had a lot of things done to me, Renee responded, making the doctor look at me in a definitely unfriendly way, reassessing his judgment of me. Not me, I assured him. Oh, no, not Master. Master did it, not him, said Renee, only further confusing the doc. I smiled at his confusion. You know me. Could you even picture me doing anything to Renee that she didn't agree to? He relaxed and queried, should I leave it, then? She almost blinded us as her face lit up so bright. I can have kids, she shouted. 100 if you want, sweetheart, I said. Doc never moved so fast in his life, as he shuffled out the door, closing it quickly behind him. Renee had thrown herself at me, determined to start on the 100 immediately. As she maneuvered around my broken leg, I waited to tell her that the ethnogistral implant had to be removed first. Epilogue. The Enterprise was dismantled, and the mechanism was destroyed, along with all my notes and blueprints. I'd found a true treasure in 113, and didn't plan to endanger it. I quit my professorship. I could research and write on my own, if I wanted. I had the money to fund myself. But for now, Renee and Danny have been my life. I want nothing that would endanger that new, precious existence. The end. Just kidding. Stay, friends. I thought you would be curious about the original Renee, so let us go and give her a visit. Number 1. Renee woke up when the belt slashed across her naked peach. She screamed and jumped up, hurt and indignant, to be faced with her husband, shouting for her to assume the position. The screaming war that ensued ended with Renee crumbling on the floor, sobbing as her husband furiously described a crosshatch pattern of whip marks on her back. She sobbed when he and his 3 friends took their turns. She screamed when they pet her, never having had her backside violated before. It was something she'd become used to in the weeks, months, and years that followed. The 3 had been drunk as they roughly took her, so it wasn't until the next day, as she tried to dress and sneak out of the house before they woke up, that her husband grabbed her and yanked the clothes from her body. I thought so, he commented, looking over her body. When she tried to pull away, he backhanded her. Grabbing her hair, he twisted to make her face him and asked, how'd you get rid of the tattoos and piercings? What tattoos? She wept. Unlike on Earth Prime, this version of her husband wasn't known for his genius or his curiosity. He was simply known as a rich son of a witch opportunist. No matter. Now we've got a whole new canvas, and we'll film all the tattooing and piercings, he decided. She pulled away, trying to slap him. You're not tattooing me. He slapped her. He slapped her again. He slapped her until she lost count or the ability to understand the word slap. When he yelled, assume the position, for the first time, r3ligious did so, hoping to end the slap fest. It wouldn't be her last time doing so. How dare you defy me, he yelled at the confused quivering body. I think I'll go ahead with that double D augmentation you sweet talked me out of. He smiled wickedly. And maybe that neck tattoo. Slot, maybe, right along your jawline, where it can't be hidden, even with a turtleneck. As fresh sobs arose from the ground, he reconsidered. No, I think Duck Me might be more to the point, whore. And tonight, I'm calling over Lilith and her group of sadistic lesbos. You need some punishment and they love a good whipping and fisting. As he dialed, he put his feet up on the prostrated woman, and planned a whole new series of movies for the slot. The earlier ones had been way too tame. More humiliating, kinkier. And maybe set a new GB record. She could do it. He was sure. They film her sensitive bits being tattooed and pierced as punishment in a BDSM film. And if she could shed the tattoos once, she could do it again and they'd start all over. He licked his lips. He remembered how much he had enjoyed branding her. Maybe on both cheeks, this time. And he was sure he could do better. After all, he was a genius producer who had a sexier than hell wife and a ton of money. Wasn't he the lucky one? Meanwhile, r3ligious prostrated herself on the floor, settling into the role she was born to play. Meanwhile, back at r3ligious, I watched Renee cross the stage in our community theater. It had turned out that she loved acting and was now starring as Cecily Cardew in The Importance of Being Earnest. She displayed just the right amount of naive innocence for the role, and was wowing the audiences. I particularly enjoyed her performance, knowing her background and having the image of the lioness who had attacked me in bed last night, wantonly ravishing me with a professional ability. On stage, Renee looked at me in the audience, batting her eyes and smiling a deliciously wicked, but innocent, smile. Best part of all. She still has that perfect peach that I had admired in college. Only now, that peach is mine. The guy on my right leaned over and said, boy, that broad can really act. I could only shake my head and agree. You have no idea. That's it for today. Thank you for keeping me company. I hope you liked the Scorched Universe Revenge. If you enjoyed today's story, drop a like and comment before you leave. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any video. Goodbye for now, and no matter which universe I am in, I will still see you for our next story.